The noise of Alex's voice cut through the clinking of dishes like a sharp knife. "Alara, bring me some tea now." I paused, my hand in soapy water. "Wait, I'm doing the dishes." "What?" His voice was full of disbelief and impatience. "Stop that and bring me the tea quickly. Can't you follow simple orders?" "But," I started, but he cut me off. "What a useless wife you are. Make me some sweet coffee, please." It was Mrs. Whitmore, my mother-in-law, speaking from the living room. She was eating a slice of cake she'd taken from the fridge, her eyes glinting with spite. I sighed, looking at the pile of dishes. "There are so many. Leave them for later. Just do what we say, useless wife." Alex's words hit like a whip, each one stinging. I was Alara, a 28-year-old working mother feeling trapped in a life that felt more like a prison than a home. I got married at 23, hoping for love and companionship. Instead, I found myself stuck with Alex and his demanding mother. Our 4-year-old son was my only source of joy in a bleak world. We lived in Alex's parents' house, a decision I had to accept under the pretense of taking care of Mrs. Whitmore after my father-in-law passed away. At first, I felt sorry for her, thinking she was grieving, but soon I realized I was just a pawn in her cruel game of domestic control. No matter how much I cooked, cleaned, or worked, it was never enough. My efforts were always met with scorn. My meals were either left untouched or harshly criticized. "The stir-fry is so half-hearted," Mrs. Whitmore would sneer. "Cook it properly from scratch." "I'm busy and can only make simple things," I'd say, trying to sound calm. "That's why I hate backtalk from a daughter-in-law," she'd snap. "Cook from scratch." "Why don't you cook then? You're a good cook, right?" I dared to ask once, immediately regretting it. "Why would I do housework when you're here?" Her response was cold and dismissive. "Are you out of your mind?" Their cruelty got worse over time. They stopped talking to me altogether, as if I were a ghost in my own home. My presence, once just unappreciated, now felt completely invisible. 5 years passed in this suffocating atmosphere. Alex and I turned 35 and 33, respectively. Our son grew up, but the heavy atmosphere in the house didn't change. My mother-in-law, now 63, seemed to enjoy my unhappiness. One evening, as I walked home from work, I felt a heavy realization sink in. My life seemed meaningless. To them, I was like a shadow, unnoticed and ignored. The only person who seemed to see me was my son. The idea of losing even that little bit of recognition was too much to bear. When I got home, I started cooking right away, trying to push away the sadness. I made mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork, hoping to make our dinner feel normal. "Bring me the mayo," Alex suddenly commanded, breaking his long silence. "Sure, here you are," I replied, handing him the mayonnaise. His first words to me in ages weren't thankful or conversational, just another command. It was too much, the final straw. I couldn't tolerate it anymore. The evening got worse when Mrs. Whitmore said, "Clean the toilet." "What? Right now?" I couldn't believe it. "Yes, right now," she insisted, her voice full of bitterness. I couldn't hold back my frustration. "Don't say such things while we're eating. It's disgusting, just like your heart," she hissed, and our argument quickly escalated, with Alex joining in, demanding. I apologized to his mother, but stood my ground for the first time in years. The conflict reached its peak, and I made a decision. I needed to get out of this toxic situation, for my son's sake as well as my own. I went to my room determined. I downloaded divorce papers, filled them out, and handed them to Alex. He was shocked, but I felt nothing but determination. "I'm filing these," I said firmly. As I faced my husband's surprised expression, I realized I had finally stepped out of the shadows. It was time to take control of my life. In the days after I declared my intention to divorce, there were a lot of angry looks and hurtful words, but in the middle of it all, I felt a strange sense of freedom. One evening, as I served dinner, Mrs. Whitmore looked at the meal with disgust. "You call this food? Even a child cooks better." I held back my frustration, focusing on my son's smile. "Eat up, sweetheart. I made your favorite tonight." Alex jumped in, sarcastic. "Oh, now suddenly you're the perfect mother, huh? What a joke." I could feel anger rising, but I stayed calm. "I'm just trying to make a nice dinner for our son." Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "Don't act like you're better than us. You're just a nuisance in this house." The tension at the table was thick. Alex's insults kept coming. So, Alara, have you even thought about how you'll manage after the divorce? You can barely handle running a household, let alone your own life. I looked him in the eye. I've been supporting this family for years. I'm not worried about taking care of myself and our son. His smirk faded slightly, a hint of unease crossing his face. Mrs. Whitmore quickly stepped in. Don't be ridiculous. You rely on us more than we rely on you. The conversation shifted to money, a topic they usually avoided. You know, without my paycheck, this household would struggle. I said more to myself than to them. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. We'll manage. We don't need your charity. But Alex's silence said it all. He knew the truth. Without my income, they would be in trouble. In the following days, their behavior became more unpredictable. Mrs. Whitmore would switch between trying to persuade me to stay and hurling insults when I resisted. Alex, meanwhile, seemed lost, his confident demeanor fading as the reality of his financial reliance on me sank in. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them that sent shivers down my spine. Leaving her is not an option, Alex whispered angrily. We rely on her money. Mrs. Whitmore's response was chillingly calculated. Don't fret, I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable she won't even think about leaving. Hearing their true intentions shocked me. They didn't care about me or our son. It was all about control and money. That night, lying in bed, a plan began to form. If they wanted a fight, they would get one, but not with arguments. I would hit them where it hurt most, their pride and their wallets. The next morning, I set my plan in motion. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman. I want a divorce, and I want to ensure they don't get more than they deserve, I told her. She nodded firmly. We'll make sure of that. You've been the main provider, right? We'll use that. With each passing day, my determination only grew stronger. I started keeping records of everything. The insults, the financial tricks, even the smallest annoyances. It was time to make them face the music. They needed to see the consequences of their actions. As I gathered evidence, I felt a sense of strength. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life. The shadows of disrespect were fading away, and in their place, a new beginning was emerging. As the divorce process started, the tension at home grew worse. But with each passing day, my fear faded, replaced by determination. One evening, Mrs. Whitmore tried a different approach. Alara dear, why don't we forget all this unpleasantness? You know we're family, she said, but her words were dripping with insincerity. I held her gaze steady. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Alex, who had been silent, scoffed. Oh, now you're the victim. You're not as innocent as you act. I felt anger rising, but I stayed calm. I'm not pretending anything, Alex. I'm just not willing to be your punching bag anymore. The conversation shifted to money, as it often did. You think you can just take our son and go? How will you support him? Alex challenged. I smiled confidently. I've been supporting this family for years. I'll manage. Mrs. Whitmore's sneer twisted into her face. You're nothing without us. You'll come begging to return. But their words didn't affect me anymore. I knew my value and the truth. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. She outlined the plan clearly. We'll expose their financial dependence on you. It'll be crucial in the custody battle and dividing assets. I nodded, feeling validated. The law was backing me, and I was ready to stand up for myself. At home, the tension reached its peak. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to undermine me became more desperate. You think you're clever, she spat one evening, but you're just abandoning your family. I looked her straight in the eye. No, I'm finally standing up for myself. Alex joined in, his voice full of anger. You'll regret this. You can't survive without me. But I wasn't afraid of his threats anymore. As days passed, I prepared for the court battle. I gathered financial documents, recorded their hurtful words, and collected evidence of their neglect. One afternoon, as I sorted through my papers, my son came to me. Mom, are we going to be okay? His voice was small and uncertain. I pulled him close, feeling a surge of protectiveness. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We're leaving this place and starting a new happy life. Just you and me. His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, I knew I was doing the right thing. I was fighting for my son's future, not just for myself. The day of the court hearing approached, bringing a sense of impending freedom. I was ready to confront Alex and Mrs. Whitmore, to put an end to their control and abuse. I was ready to take back my life and give my son the peace and happiness he deserved. It was time for justice, and I was determined to see it through. The day of the court hearing arrived, a day I had been dreading yet eagerly awaiting. Sitting across from Alex and Mrs. Whitmore in the courtroom, I felt a surreal mix of emotions. This was the moment of change. The proceedings began formally. Alex's lawyer painted him as a devoted husband and father, unfairly accused. Mrs. Whitmore portrayed herself as a grieving mother-in-law, mistreated by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. But their act was transparent, their lies obvious. When it was my turn to speak, I spoke clearly, my voice steady. I have been the only one working to support this family for years. My husband's unemployment and his mother's manipulation have caused constant strain. Alex interrupted, pretending to be hurt. Alara, how can you say these things? I turned to him, my gaze firm. Support isn't just words, Alex. It's about actions, and your actions have been selfish and cruel. The judge listened as I presented my evidence. Financial documents, recordings of their verbal abuse, testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed their behavior. The truth was clear. As the evidence piled up, Alex's facade crumbled. Mrs. Whitmore's calm demeanor cracked, revealing her true nature. The courtroom fell silent, tension thick in the air. Then came the bombshell that sealed their fate. My lawyer presented evidence, photographs and documents proving Alex's infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's affair with a neighbor, Mr. Harwood. The courtroom buzzed as the images were shown, revealing their deceit for all to see. Alex paled, his eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Whitmore's anger twisted her expression, her hands shaking. You violated our privacy, she shrieked, her voice piercing. I met her gaze calmly. No, I exposed the truth, a truth you both tried to hide for too long. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Their credibility crumbled, their lies laid bare. As the hearing ended, the judge's decision was clear. I was granted full custody of our son, and assets were divided fairly. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were left with nothing but their ruined reputations. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt like a burden had been lifted. The years of manipulation and abuse were finally behind me. I had stood up to them and won. But the best moment was when my son ran into my arms outside, his face beaming with relief. We did it, Ma, he said happily. Yes, we did, I replied, hugging him tightly. We're free now. This is just the beginning for us. As we walked away together, I knew this victory wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who's ever felt small or powerless. It was for truth and fairness. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with hope and a better future. The aftermath of the court ruling was swift and chaotic. News of Alex and Mrs. Whitmore's deceit spread quickly, staining their reputations in our small community. They could no longer hide behind their facade of respectability. In the days after the verdict, I focused on rebuilding my life with my son, but I couldn't ignore the satisfaction of knowing they were facing the consequences. One evening, while preparing dinner, I had an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Harwood, Mr. Harwood's wife, her eyes filled with tears. Alara, I heard everything. I can't believe what Sylvia, Mrs. Whitmore, did, she said, her voice trembling with pain. I invited her in, offering a cup of tea. As we sat at the kitchen table, she poured out her heartache. I trusted her as a neighbor, as a friend, and to think she was having an affair with my husband. I listened, offering comfort. It was clear Mrs. Whitmore's actions had caused more damage than she anticipated. The next day, I ran into Alex in town. He looked defeated, a shadow of his former self, his arrogance gone. I paused, facing him. What's left to say, Alex? He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much I relied on you, on your strength. His apology, though belated, marked a shift in power. He had lost everything. His pride, his home, his family. And in that loss, he finally acknowledged his mistakes. But it was Mrs. Whitmore who faced the harshest consequences. Her affair with Mr. Harwood had not only tarnished her reputation, but also led to legal troubles. Mrs. Harwood had filed for divorce and was suing her for alienation of affection. I heard about Mrs. Whitmore's downfall through whispers and rumors from neighbors, painting a picture of a woman brought down by her own actions. She became an outcast, rejected by those she once called friends. One afternoon, I spotted her at the grocery store, her demeanor defeated as she hurried through the aisles. Our paths crossed, and our eyes met briefly. The resentment and defeat in her gaze were clear. You did this to me, she muttered as she passed by. I watched her go, feeling a mix of pity and vindication. No, Sylvia, you did this to yourself, I whispered to myself. The tables had turned, and the consequences of their choices were now unavoidable. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were facing the consequences of their years of deceit and manipulation. As I saw them struggle, I understood that the greatest revenge was living well, free from their toxicity. Refocusing on my son and our new life, I realized this wasn't just about revenge. It was about freedom, breaking away from abuse and control. Looking ahead, I knew the best was yet to come.